Cold cyan luminescence bathed the primary reception bay of the Interstellar Medical Station, St. Ilex Array. Amber warning strips pulsed along the pristine white bulkheads. The low, thrumming heartbeat of heavy magnetic anchors vibrated through the floor plating. Elias Rook stood near the edge of the docking ring. He wore a heavy rescue rig, his broad shoulders and thick muscular build contrasting sharply with the delicate, sterile aesthetics of the alien hospital. He breathed in the filtered, metallic air. He was a human, a Deathworlder. Right now, he was just a salvage and rescue technician waiting to assist a border casualty transport. The transport pod breached the outer containment shield. It was a battered vessel, scarred by micrometeorites and plasma burns. The automated docking clamps engaged. A soft pressure corridor extended from the station. The flexible tube of smart polymers bridged the hard vacuum of space, connecting the transport to the station triage bay. Anti-gravity beds began to float through the corridor, carrying heavily injured alien colonists from the fringe sectors. Then, a violent shudder tore through the station. The magnetic anchors shrieked. It sounded like a dying leviathan tearing through the hull. Desynchronization. The catastrophic failure cascaded through the docking system in a fraction of a heartbeat. The soft pressure corridor violently twisted under the sudden shift in mass. The polymer tore open. Atmosphere vented into the infinite dark. A white fog of rapidly freezing oxygen exploded outward. The anti-gravity beds instantly lost their tethers. Alien bodies, fragile and injured, were violently thrown from their repulsor fields. Panic erupted, completely swallowed by the silent, terrifying roar of escaping air. Automated vacuum blast doors triggered. Thick slabs of reinforced titanium alloy began to slide shut to seal off the breach. Elias planted his heavy magnetic boots. He fought the hurricane pull of the void. Through the freezing mist, he saw her, a Lori physician. Her species was built of delicate, interlocking bone fragments and translucent crystalline tissue. She was caught directly in the threshold. The blast doors were closing right on top of her. Worse, behind her, in the collapsing remnants of the soft corridor, 3 patient pods were drifting backward. They were spinning out of the safe zone. They were heading straight toward the ambient radiation flare of the transport vessel's unshielded engine wash. Elias did not calculate the physics. He did not run a survival probability matrix. The human brain bypassed logic and went straight to pure, adrenal instinct. He launched himself forward. He threw his body directly into the closing gap of the blast doors. His left shoulder hit the hydraulic edge. His muscles screamed. He used his own dense skeletal structure as a physical wedge against a door designed to stop a micrometeor impact. The metal ground against his armored suit. He grabbed the terrified Lori doctor by her medical harness and hurled her backward into the safe zone of the triage bay. He reached out into the tearing winds of the vacuum. He grabbed the heavy manual tether lines of 2 drifting patient pods. He slammed his fist down on their emergency physical locks. The heavy metal clasps snapped into the floor grating. At that exact microsecond, the anchor core critically failed. A localized gravity shockwave ripped outward from the engine manifold. It hit Elias like a kinetic strike from an orbital railgun. The sheer force compressed his spine with a sickening, wet crunch. His vertebrae shifted violently out of alignment. His ribcage absorbed the secondary shock. Multiple ribs fractured instantly, snapping like dry wood in a silent room. Simultaneously, the biological hazard failsafes of the docking ring short-circuited. A massive biomagnetic arc lashed out from the broken conduit. The blue lightning whipped across his back. It flash-fried his peripheral nervous system. It felt like liquid fire had been injected directly into his spinal fluid. His left leg went completely numb, severed entirely from his brain's command center. The ceiling grid above him collapsed. A heavy alloy framing bar plummeted. It smashed into his chest, pinning him brutally against the deck plating. Overhead, a ruptured coolant line sprayed ionized radiation across his exposed shoulders and upper back. His skin instantly blackened. The flesh blistered and burned down to the muscle tissue in a matter of seconds. Inside the sealed triage bay, the overarching medical scanners went absolutely frantic. Alarms screamed in 20 different harmonic frequencies. The alien trauma teams watched the overhead telemetry displays in absolute, paralyzed horror. The holographic scanners broke down Elias's biometric data in real time. Spinal subluxation, massive skeletal trauma, severe ionizing radiation burns covering 30% of his upper torso, systemic neurological shock. According to every medical database in the United Federation, the amount of trauma inflicted on the bipedal technician was an absolute threshold event. Any other species on the St. Ilex array would have suffered immediate, irreversible cardiovascular collapse. They would be comatose within a single microsecond. They would be permanently paralyzed, if not instantly dead. The sensory overload alone should have completely shut down his brainstem. Beneath the crushing weight of the alloy beam, surrounded by the stench of his own burning flesh, Elias Rook did not die. He did not pass out. He choked. He coughed up a thick spray of crimson blood that splattered heavily against his cracked visor. He gasped for air, his punctured lung fighting to expand against the crushed ribs. He turned his head toward the reinforced glass of the blast doors. His comlink crackled to life. It was filled with static and the wet, ragged sound of his breathing. "Get the pods," Elias rasped. His voice was a grinding growl of pure physical agony, but the command was absolute. "Get the damn pods into the sterile field. They are venting atmosphere. They have less than 2 minutes of oxygen. Stop looking at my vitals and get them out." The alien medical staff froze. They stood paralyzed behind the safety glass. They were staring at a ghost. They were listening to a corpse issue triage orders. He was prioritizing the suspended patients because his savage, primitive brain recognized they were dying faster than he was. The entire reception sector watched in a terrified, breathless trance. The Lori doctor he had just saved was trembling on the floor, her crystalline eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Elias planted his hands against the blood-slicked deck. His thick biceps bulged. Veins stood out like thick blue cords against his dirt-streaked neck. He gritted his teeth, fresh blood dripping from his chin, with a monstrous, guttural roar that echoed through the open comms. He pushed. The heavy alloy beam shifted. Metal shrieked against metal. It scraped off his crushed chest and slammed onto the floor beside him. Elias Rook pulled his knees up. His left leg hung uselessly. It trembled violently, the severed nerve pathways screaming in misfired agony. It looked as though the limb would snap off at the joint under his own weight. He ignored the impossibility of his own anatomy. He grabbed a nearby broken railing. He dragged his heavy, battered frame upward. The sickening sound of his shifting, fractured spine was audible through his suit microphones. He stood up. He swayed. He was a towering, broken silhouette of blackened flesh, cracked bones, and bleeding muscle standing amidst the wreckage. The alien doctors shrank back from the glass. They were overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying force of a creature that simply refused to stop functioning. Elias dragged his numb left leg forward. He took one step. The deck plating smeared with his blood. He took a second step. He took a third step, moving deliberately away from the wreckage. His eyes locked forward, before the shadows of the medical bay finally began to close in around his vision. The sterile white lighting of the triage bay felt suddenly inadequate against the sheer, violent reality of the human standing in its center. The massive blast doors had fully sealed behind him, cutting off the howl of the vacuum, leaving a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the frantic chirping of life support monitors. Elias Rook's third step faltered. His heavy boot slammed onto the deck, and his ruined knee buckled. He did not fall completely. He caught himself against the edge of a hover gurney, his breath a wet, jagged rasp. The alien medical staff broke from their paralysis. A swarm of drones and multi-limbed orderlies rushed forward, but it was head of trauma Dr. Ilir Safin who reached him first. Ilir was a being of soft, pliable crystalline structures. Her species adapted to deep-pressure oceanic worlds. She specialized in catastrophic structural failures of the skeleton, accustomed to repairing shattered silica and calcium lattices. She held up a luminescent diagnostic wand, her translucent fingers trembling as the readouts projected into the air between them. "Do not move," Ilir commanded, her voice synthesizing through her translation collar in a sharp, melodic chime. "By every metric of physiological cohesion, your cervical nerves are severed. The kinetic shockwave displaced your lower spine by 4 degrees. You should be completely paralyzed from the neck down." Beside her, Dr. Oren Kesh, an avian-descended neurologist whose plumage bristled with nervous static, peered at a secondary neuromatrix display. His beak clicked rapidly. "The spinal signals are fragmented," Oren said, his tone wavering between profound confusion and scientific alarm. "They are completely broken at the impact site. Yet, the lower extremities are still attempting to ping the cerebral cortex. The pathways are not fully dead. This contradicts all standard Federation neurological models. A centralized nervous system cannot function with this level of hardware disconnection." Elias ignored the hovering diagnostic tools. He spat another mouthful of blood onto the pristine floor. His eyes, rimmed with dark, dilated pupils, snapped toward the airlock vestibule. 2 of the patient pods he had manually tethered were locked down, but the localized gravity failure was causing the emergency airlock seals to groan under immense atmospheric pressure. "The seals are warping," Elias growled. "Help me pull them past the secondary bulkhead." "You are experiencing terminal shock," Ilir stated, signaling for a heavy-duty trauma stretcher. "Get him onto the stabilization field immediately." "No," Elias snarled. He shoved the floating stretcher away with his right arm, the muscles straining against the blackened, burned skin of his shoulder. "If those seals blow, the pods get sucked back into the engine wash. Pull them in. Now." The sheer, commanding gravity of his voice, devoid of panic and saturated with terrifying focus, forced the alien staff to obey. Even with a shattered ribcage and a leg that dragged uselessly behind him, the human threw his uninjured shoulder against the heavy manual release wheel of the vestibule. Ilir and Orun, along with 3 orderlies, rushed to aid him. Together, they dragged the heavy medical pods over the threshold, just as the outer vestibule seal gave way with a violent hiss, slamming the secondary bulkhead shut permanently. Only then did Elias let his grip fail. He collapsed onto the deck, his massive frame hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The medical team swarmed him. Orderlies immediately deployed a Federation standard rigid splint. The device, designed to instantly freeze the skeletal structure of delicate alien anatomies to prevent further injury, activated with a sharp hiss. It clamped down on Elias's back, driving microstabilizers into his skin to lock his spine in place. The reaction was instantaneous. Elias let out a choked, guttural sound, his back arching unnaturally. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his heart rate spiked to 300 beats per minute before he violently passed out. The monitor screamed a flatline warning for precisely 4 seconds. Then, he gasped, snapping back into consciousness with a violent shudder. Cold sweat mingled with the grime on his face. "Take it off," he choked out, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like the bone might crack. "It is stabilizing your fracture," Ilir pleaded, her crystalline hands hovering over his chest. "You must endure it." "It is a linear alignment lock," Elias hissed, his voice remarkably steady despite the blinding agony. "Human spines have a natural double curve. Your splint is forcing my lumbar vertebrae straight. It is actively compressing the spinal marrow and pinching the remaining nerve roots. Disengage the microstabilizers or you will permanently sever the cord." Oren Kesh stared at the human. The avian doctor's feathers flattened completely. The staff were completely stunned. It was not just that the Deathworlder was still speaking after enduring pain that would have caused immediate brain death in a lorry or an avian. It was the fact that he was clinically, coldly, and pragmatically analyzing his own catastrophic trauma from the inside out. He was dictating his own triage. Elir hastily entered the override codes. The rigid splint released its pressure. Elias let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body instantly relaxing back into a slightly curved, natural posture. The vital monitors immediately showed a marginal decrease in spinal inflammation. The human had been right. "Move him to the biosurgery bay," Elir ordered, her voice hushed, lacking its usual authoritative volume. "Do not use rigid restraints. Use a fluid suspension field." They levitated Elias onto the specialized field. As the trauma team hurried down the long, sweeping corridors toward the inner hospital rings, the human struggled to keep his eyes open. Blood loss and shock were finally beginning to drag him under. Yet, he grabbed the sleeve of a passing orderly. "Sector 4, Elias slurred, his words thick. The manifest showed 3 more pods in the lower cargo bay of the transport. The transport took a kinetic hit. The cargo bay doors were jammed. Tell the 0G team to cut through the ventral hull. They are still in there." He released the orderly's sleeve, and finally let his head fall back, his breathing turning shallow. Behind the procession, a chilling murmur began to spread among the station personnel. Nurses and technicians, species from a dozen different peaceful core worlds, watched the bloody trail left in the hallway. They whispered in their native tongues. They spoke of the Terran technicians who worked the hazardous salvage routes. They whispered that a Deathworlder was not truly a patient. They said it was a biological weapon masquerading as a sentient being, a monster built of calcium, iron, and pure, unreasonable spite against the laws of physics. Dr. Elir Safin walked beside the suspension field, her translucent face glowing with a mixture of absolute terror and profound scientific fascination. Her medical textbooks from the Federation Academy had categorized Deathworld biology as a theoretical extreme. The texts spoke of organisms from high gravity, hyper-competitive biospheres, where evolution prioritized raw survival over delicate efficiency. It was treated as a medical myth, a cautionary tale about the violent fringes of the galaxy. Now, she was looking down at one, a creature that could weaponize its own adrenaline, compartmentalize agonizing pain, and refuse to die simply out of stubbornness. The doors to the primary biosurgery bay hissed open. The room was a vast dome of sterile white light and advanced robotic appendages. They transferred Elias onto the central diagnostic slab. "Initiate a deep molecular scan," Elir commanded, taking her position at the primary console. "I need to know exactly what is keeping his central nervous system from collapsing. Run a full blood tox screen and a cellular matrix review." The massive scanner descended from the ceiling, bathing Elias in a deep, penetrating violet light. For 60 seconds, the room was perfectly silent, save for the hum of the machinery processing the complex data. Then, the main display flickered. The holographic projection of Elias's internal structure materialized in the center of the room. The glowing red fractures along his ribs and spine were glaring. The dark, necrotic tissue from the radiation burns painted a grim picture on his shoulders. But that was not what drew a synchronized gasp from the surgical team. "Doctor." Oren Kesh stepped closer to the projection, his beak slightly open. "Elir, look at his circulatory system." Elir magnified the holographic blood flow. Amidst the red and white blood cells, amidst the standard biological markers of a Terran physiology, there was something else. Microscopic, bioluminescent clusters were moving through Elias's veins. They were not human cells. They were not synthetic nanites from any known Federation manufacturer. They were living particles, complex and rhythmic, gathering in dense swarms around the areas of his most severe trauma. They pulsed with a faint, silvery light, completely alien to the station's massive biological database. They were unknown, undocumented, and they were inside his blood. "Administer a Class 4 systemic analgesic," Elir commanded, her crystalline digits dancing across the primary infusion terminal. "Start with 50 units of standard synthetic opiate analogs. That dosage is sufficient to render a mature, heavily armored Veltarian pack beast completely insensate." A multi-limbed surgical drone hovered over Elias, deploying a pneumatic syringe directly into the unburned flesh of his right shoulder. The clear, viscous fluid vanished under his skin. Elir watched the primary biological monitors, expecting the violent spikes of his neural activity to finally smooth into the gentle curves of artificial sedation. Instead, the readouts flared brighter. Within exactly 12 seconds, the human hepatic system recognized the foreign chemical. Elias's liver, an organ evolved in a biosphere, teeming with natural toxins, went into immediate, aggressive overdrive. Enormous quantities of specialized enzymes flooded his bloodstream. The monitors displayed the alien chemical compounds being systematically shredded, metabolized, and flushed from his system before they could even reach his cerebral cortex. Elias let out a sharp, ragged breath, his jaw muscles clenching so hard that the sound of grinding enamel echoed in the sterile room. The pain had not diminished by a single fraction. "The analgesic is gone," Orenkesh whispered, his beak clicking in rapid, nervous succession as he monitored the chemical breakdown. His internal filtration system dismantled it entirely. "It is treating our highest-grade painkillers as a minor dietary toxin. We must block the nociceptors locally," Elir stated, shifting her strategy. "Bring me a sterile cartridge of neural stasis gel. We will freeze the synaptic pathways around the thoracic fractures." An orderly rushed forward with a metallic cylinder containing a glowing blue compound. Elir carefully applied a thick layer of the cold gel directly over the inflamed, bruised skin along the center of Elias's back, targeting the crushed nerve clusters. The gel was designed to interface with the epidermal layer, sinking down to coat the nerve endings in a localized, paralytic stasis. The moment the blue substance made contact, Elias's body rebelled with terrifying ferocity. His core temperature spiked locally around the application site. The skin turned a violent, angry crimson as a massive localized immune cascade was triggered. Millions of white blood cells, macrophages, and aggressive antibodies rushed to the site of the chemical intrusion. The tissue swelled instantly, violently weeping clear lymphatic fluid that actively pushed the gel away from the nerve pathways. "His immune system is attacking the stasis matrix," Oren said, taking a step back from the diagnostic table. "It is rejecting the paralytic as a hostile biological pathogen. It is literally boiling the gel out of his pores." The avian neurologist turned his attention to the core biometric display. His feathers puffed out in a display of profound shock. He tapped the holographic screen. "Look at these thresholds," Oren said, his voice trembling. "Heart rate is sustaining at 190 beats per minute. Core temperature is fluctuating at 41 degrees Celsius. Systolic blood pressure is resting at 210. By every known metric in the Federation medical database, his cardiovascular system should have ruptured 3 minutes ago. His brain proteins should be denaturing. He should be dead." Elias opened his eyes. The capillaries in his sclera were burst, turning the whites of his eyes a stark, terrifying red. He looked directly at the avian doctor. "Still functional," Elias rasped, the words forced out between shallow, ragged breaths. Elir let out a sound of sheer frustration. The St. Ilex Array was a premier fringe facility, but humanity had only joined the interstellar network a mere 5 standard cycles ago. The station possessed no dedicated biosurgical kits tailored for Terran physiology. There were no human-specific anesthetics, no proper surgical scaffolds, and no established surgical protocols. Everything had to be improvised on the edge of a knife. "I am discarding the multi-species trauma manual," Elir announced. waving her hand through the holographic projection to delete the standard operating procedures. She leaned over Elias, her translucent, glowing face coming into his line of sight. "Technician Rook, our medicines cannot bypass your immune responses. We cannot use rigid structural supports without severing your spinal cord. You are conscious. You know your own anatomy. Tell me exactly how to position you so your nervous system does not collapse." Elias swallowed hard, fighting the copper taste of blood in his mouth. "Elevate the knees," he instructed, his voice a low, mechanical grind. "Bring them up 45 degrees. It will take the tension off the lower lumbar muscles. Do not lock my hips. Let my core muscles spasm. They are going to seize up to create a natural biological splint around the broken bones. It will hurt, but it will hold the vertebrae in place." Ilir gestured to the robotic orderlies. The surgical table contorted, lifting Elias's legs exactly as he commanded. As the tension shifted, his abdominal wall locked into a state of rigid, agonizing tetany. He let out a low, sustained groan, but the dangerous pressure on his spinal cord visibly decreased on the monitors. "Now," Elias choked out, "cut away the necrotic tissue on the burns. Leave the raw muscle. Just get the ionized flesh off." The surgical team moved to his upper back and shoulders, utilizing precision sonic scalpels to debride the blackened, ruined flesh caused by the radiation blast. As they cleared away the dead layers, the deep, violet light of the surgical scanners illuminated the exposed muscle fibers. Oren Kesh leaned in close, bringing a high-resolution magnification lens over the open wounds. "The microscopic anomalies," Oren noted, pointing to the biometric feed. "The foreign particles in his bloodstream. They are congregating at the site of the catastrophic tissue damage." Ilir joined him. The strange, silvery bioluminescent clusters they had detected earlier were not behaving like a standard infection. They were not multiplying out of control, nor were they consuming the host's cellular structure like a parasite. Instead, thousands of the microscopic entities were anchoring themselves to the ragged edges of Elias's torn muscle fibers and broken capillaries. They arranged themselves in complex, geometric lattices over the damage. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying purpose, as if they were physically reading the genetic code of the destroyed tissue. "They are not an invasive pathogen," Ilir whispered, utterly captivated by the microscopic ballet. "They are mapping the structural failure." A young, four-armed nursing assistant from the telemetry station suddenly called out, "Dr. Safin, Dr. Kesh, look at the neural frequency overlay." The nurse synchronized the visual feed of the glowing particles with Elias's electroencephalogram. The result was mesmerizing. The tiny, silver clusters in Elias's open wounds were pulsating with a faint, rhythmic light. The flashes of bioluminescence perfectly matched the heavy, jagged spikes of Elias's brainwaves. Every time a surge of pain fired through his central nervous system, the particles flared in exact unison. "They are synced to his bioelectrical field," the nurse said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "They are listening to his nervous system." Before Ilir could process the implication of the nurse's discovery, a violent convulsion ripped through Elias's body. He threw his head back against the surgical table, a raw, unearthly scream tearing from his throat. The muscles in his neck strained to the point of tearing. The monitors flared crimson as a massive surge of pure neurological energy cascaded down his spinal column. It was a wave of phantom pain, a catastrophic misfire of the severed nerve endings in his lower back. The orderlies rushed forward to hold him down, but Ilir threw her hands up, shouting for them to stay back, terrified that any external force would permanently sever the fragile, fragmented spinal cord. The seizure lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Then, Elias collapsed back against the table, his chest heaving, his entire body drenched in cold, metallic-smelling sweat. The room fell into a stunned, horrifying silence. Then, Oren Kesh pointed a trembling, feathered digit at the bottom of the surgical bed. "By the ancestors," Oren breathed, at the end of his paralyzed, completely numb, left leg. Elias's heavy, blood-stained toes twitched. It was not a random muscle spasm. It was a slow, deliberate curl of the digits, followed by a slight, purposeful rotation of the ankle joint. A joint that, according to every medical scan, was disconnected entirely from his brain. Dr. Ilir Safin stared at the moving foot, then up at the holographic display showing the fragmented spinal cord, and finally, at the pulsing, alien particles repairing the tissue in his back. A profound, chilling realization settled over her. The most terrifying aspect of the human lying on her operating table was not the sheer amount of catastrophic trauma he had survived. The true terror was that Elias Rook was not slowly dying in her surgical bay. His profoundly stubborn, violent biology was actively rewriting the very rules of its own survival right in front of their eyes. The heavy atmospheric scrubbers of the St. Ilex array usually hummed with a comforting, barely perceptible vibration. Now, that low frequency felt like a methodical countdown. While the human technician remained heavily monitored in the central biosurgery dome, a chilling pattern began to emerge across the outer recovery wards, shifting the atmosphere from isolated trauma to widespread, simmering dread. 3 of the alien colonists, pulled from the ruptured transport pod, began to deteriorate simultaneously. At first, the attending physicians attributed their sudden decline to the sheer kinetic trauma of the docking failure and the subsequent vacuum exposure. However, their symptoms aggressively diverged from all known physiological shock profiles in the Federation database. A heavy-set miner of the Veltarian caste lost all voluntary motor function in his lower primary appendages. It was a creeping, flaccid paralysis that defied standard neurological mapping, turning his muscles completely unresponsive. In the adjacent isolation field, a frail atmospheric skimmer exhibited profound, short-term memory erasure, suddenly unable to recall the accident, their own designation, or even how to formulate basic syntax. Most alarming of all, faint, silvery bioluminescent clusters began to surface beneath their translucent epidermal layers, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic, and utterly terrifying rhythm. The medical staff assumed these were secondary infections from the unfiltered space exposure. That fragile assumption shattered precisely 2 hours later. A senior diagnostic specialist, a robust reptilian native who had been stationed entirely in the administrative sector during the accident and had never set foot near the breached triage bay, collapsed in the middle of a crowded corridor. The specialist's vibrant scales lost their hue, turning a sickly ash gray. They exhibited the exact same creeping flaccid paralysis, their limbs going limp as the telltale silvery glow illuminated the tissue of their underbelly. The threat was no longer localized to the trauma victims. It was ambient. Environmental control algorithms were immediately overridden by the station's central medical intelligence. Deep scan molecular sensors flared across the entire grid. The results projected onto the main command screens of the medical bay in a relentless cascade of red data strings. A quantum biological spore, a microscopic entity capable of shifting its phase state to bypass physical barriers, was proliferating. It had completely evaded the standard biofilters and was rapidly saturating the atmospheric recycling network and the primary hydroponic water supply. The terrifying realization struck Dr. Ilir Safin as she cross-referenced the newly acquired environmental data with Elias Rook's continuous telemetry. The human was not simply patient zero of a bizarre infection. He was a complete biological anomaly. The quantum spores invading the alien patients were systematically overriding their central nervous systems, aggressively locking down motor function, and wiping cognitive pathways to prepare the host bodies for some unknown biological imperative. But when those same microscopic spores had entered the human bloodstream, they collided with a Deathworlder's hyper-aggressive immune response. Instead of freezing his neural pathways, the alien entities were violently subjugated. Elias's body had not been conquered. His sheer internal heat and ruthless cellular defenders had actively forced the quantum material to adapt to his own survival needs. His body was bullying the pathogen, utilizing its regenerative properties to bridge his severed nerves and knit his torn muscle fibers. He was the only infected individual on the entire station whose nervous system was not locked into a paralytic state. Panic, cold, and sharp, gripped the station hierarchy. The ruling council of the St. Ilex Array initiated a Level 1 quarantine protocol. Massive titanium blast shutters slammed over every exterior viewport, sealing the corridors in artificial twilight. The docking rings were magnetically locked, trapping dozens of civilian and supply vessels in their bays. A total communications blackout was strictly enforced. No data packets, no distress signals, and no civilian messages were permitted to leave the array until the pathogenic threat could be categorized and neutralized. The vast, floating hospital became a sealed tomb, suspended in the infinite dark. Trapped in the claustrophobic tension of the lockdown, fear quickly mutated into prejudice. Whispers echoed through the sterile corridors, amplifying the pre-existing anxieties about the newly integrated Terran species. Frightened technicians and exhausted nurses gathered in the mess halls, casting accusatory glances toward the intensive care wing where Elias lay. The prevailing theory, spreading like wildfire among the frightened staff, was that the Deathworlder was the catalyst. They argued that humanity's barbaric, hyper-aggressive cellular structure had somehow awakened a dormant, ancient pathogen carried on the border transport. They believed his brutal internal chemistry had mutated a benign organism into a devastating weapon. To them, Elias was not a brave rescue technician, but a biological hazard, a primitive monster that had doomed the entire station. Dr. Ilir Safin confronted a group of vocal administrators in the primary observation deck. Her crystalline features, usually calm and reflective, hardened with unprecedented resolve. "You are letting blind terror dictate your logic," Ilir stated, her voice projecting with sharp, undeniable authority. I stood in the primary vestibule. I watched that human throw his own body into a crushing bulkhead to save one of our own physicians. I watched him prioritize the oxygen supply of complete strangers while his own spine was shattered. He did not bring this upon us. His barbaric biology is the only reason those initial patients survived the vacuum. The administrators recoiled slightly from her fierce defense. In that moment, Ilir realized her own profound shift in perspective. The primal dread she had initially felt toward the human's impossible physiology had completely vanished, replaced by a deep, anchoring trust. Elias's biology was indeed terrifying, but his sheer willpower was fundamentally protective. He was a shield, not a sword. While Ilir quelled the rising xenophobia in the upper wards, Dr. Orun Kesh remained isolated in the high-containment laboratory, frantically attempting to decode the true quantum structure of the captured spores. The avian neurologist had bypassed standard Federation biochemical analysis, utilizing a highly advanced particle accelerator to strip away the outer deceptive layers of the anomaly. When the core structure was finally rendered on his holographic workstation, Orun felt a cold chill ripple through his feathers. "Ilir, you must look at this immediately." Orun transmitted through a secure, heavily encrypted channel to her personal data pad. Ilir hurried to the containment lab, locking the reinforced doors behind her. She found Orun staring at a glowing, three-dimensional representation of the spore's genetic lattice. It was not a chaotic, naturally evolved sequence. The nucleotide base pairs were arranged in perfect, symmetrical geometric patterns. There were repeating sequences that functioned exactly like encrypted algorithmic code, complete with error correction and command structures. "This is not a naturally occurring mutation," Orun said, his voice dropping to an anxious, breathy whisper. "There is no environmental pressure in the known galaxy that would shape a biological entity with this level of mathematical precision. It is too sophisticated. This structure bears the undeniable hallmark of intentional, intelligent design. It is engineered. The implications were devastating. The station was not dealing with an accidental outbreak or a natural disaster. They were dealing with a deployed technology, a weaponized biological agent. Orun tapped his console with a trembling talon, pulling up heavily encrypted transit manifests he had managed to slice from the station's automated cargo logs. He filtered the massive data streams, searching for any anomalies matching the unique quantum signature of the synthetic spores. The search algorithm churned for several tense minutes before locking onto a deeply buried, highly redacted file. "Look at the timestamp," Orun instructed, stepping back from the glow of the screen. Ilir leaned closer, her crystalline eyes scanning the data. The secure log detailed a highly classified, heavily shielded biological transport container that had deliberately bypassed all standard quarantine checks. The destination was listed as an undocumented auxiliary lab within the deepest levels of the station itself. The origin point was a severely restricted archaeological zone out in the dead sectors. The most chilling detail, however, was the time of arrival. The heavily shielded sample had not been brought aboard by the damaged border transport during the chaotic emergency. It had been secretly authorized and physically moved onto the St. Helix array exactly 36 hours before the docking anchors mysteriously failed. The biosurgery bay was heavily insulated, yet the silence inside felt suffocating, pressing down like a physical weight. Elias Rook refused to remain supine, ignoring the frantic, blaring alarms of the suspension field. He forced his uninjured right arm beneath his torso and violently pushed himself upward. His fractured ribs ground together with a sickening friction. The newly knit muscle fibers in his back screamed in protest, but he locked his jaw and stabilized his massive frame in a seated position. He extended a trembling, blood-stained hand toward the primary diagnostic console. He demanded the raw operational logs of the docking sequence. Dr. Ilir Safin hesitated, torn between her medical oath to keep her patient sedated and the chilling realization that standard protocols no longer applied. She bypassed the security lock and slid the transparent data slate into his waiting palm. Elias did not read the files like a patient searching for a diagnosis. He scanned the cascading columns of alphanumeric code with the cold, predatory focus of a veteran industrial salvage engineer. He had spent 10 standard cycles tearing apart derelict freighters in the asteroid belts. He knew the structural heartbeat of heavy orbital machinery better than anyone on the station. "This was not a mechanical failure," Elias rasped, his voice a low, mechanical grind echoing in the sterile room. "Magnetic docking anchors are built with triple-layered physical redundancies. They do not spontaneously lose synchronization, not even during a kinetic strike." He tapped a sequence of timestamps, expanding the data strings so the alien physicians could see the raw telemetry. "Look at the micro-timing," Elias instructed, his finger tracing a sharp spike in the graphs. The biocontainment seals in the secondary corridor initiated a rapid venting sequence, exactly 3 seconds before the primary anchors disengaged. That is a reverse pressure cascade. The localized gravity failure did not cause the pathogen leak. The pathogen leak was intentionally triggered to disguise the gravity failure. Someone deliberately routed a biohazard purge command through the heavy infrastructure grid to force a system-wide reset. It takes an expert in both biological quarantine architecture and heavy mechanics to orchestrate a blind spot that perfectly timed. The implication hung in the air, heavy and venomous. The catastrophe was a staged event. Ilir felt a cold dread crystallize in her chest. If the docking failure was engineered to release the quantum spores, then the culprit was inside the station, operating with high-level clearance. She immediately disconnected the diagnostic console from the station's central network to prevent them from being monitored. Working entirely offline, she brought up the highly classified, 3-dimensional blueprints of the station's bio-cold storage sectors. If someone smuggled an ancient biological agent aboard 36 hours ago, They would need a sustained cryogenic environment to keep the quantum material dormant. Ilir reasoned, her translucent fingers dancing rapidly across the holographic interface. Elias narrowed his eyes at the glowing blue schematic. He ignored the clearly labeled laboratories and focused entirely on the thermodynamic readouts. "Filter out the registered power grids," Elias ordered. "Show me only the ambient thermal exhaust." Ilir executed the command. The official map vanished, replaced by a ghost image of heat signatures, deep within the lower maintenance rings, directly beneath the primary morgue. A massive, undocumented thermal bloom pulsed on the screen. It was drawing enough raw power to sustain a heavy cruiser engine. Yet it existed completely off the official grid. It was a phantom laboratory. Dr. Orun Kesh utilized his specialized decryption algorithms to slice into the localized data stream radiating from the phantom thermal node. The avian neurologist bypassed 4 layers of military-grade encryption in under 5 minutes. The hidden servers spilled their contents into the surgical bay. The file directory was massive, labeled under a single, ominous operational header, Project Lazarus Veil. As Orun translated the research documents, his feathers flattened tight against his body in sheer terror. The project detailed a decades-long initiative to harness the ancient quantum spores recovered from the dead sectors. The theoretical objective was miraculous, deploying the spores to instantly regenerate catastrophically crushed tissue and severed nerve clusters in interstellar combat casualties. "It was designed to be the ultimate trauma response," Orun whispered, his beak trembling as he read the simulated clinical trials. "But the pathology reports from the undocumented test subjects are horrifying. In 99% of known sentient species, the Lazarus Veil does not actually heal the host. It utilizes the host's biological material to replicate. It actively severes the original neural pathways and replaces them with a highly complex, collective control network. The patients are not recovering. They are being hollowed out, turned into living, synchronized vessels for the spore colony." Elias looked down at his own forearms. Beneath his skin, the faint, silvery bioluminescence continued to throb in time with his racing heartbeat. The terrifying truth crashed over him. "I am not immune," Elias stated quietly, staring at his glowing veins. Ilir and Orun turned to him, stricken. "My body is not rejecting the takeover," Elias continued, his breathing growing shallow as a fresh wave of unnatural heat radiated from his core. "Human internal temperature runs hot. My immune system is exceptionally violent. I am currently running a fever of 41 degrees Celsius. My white blood cells are fighting a scorched earth campaign inside my own arteries. But the spores are just waiting. I am not immune. I am just enduring a prolonged siege. The sheer biological noise of my human metabolism is the only thing delaying the neural override." The room grew colder as they realized the clock was ticking, not just for the station, but for the human who had saved them. Orun desperately scrolled to the bottom of the Project Lazarus Veil manifesto, searching for the ultimate authority who had sanctioned such an atrocity. He expected to see the insignia of a rogue military intelligence faction or a corrupt corporate conglomerate. Instead, he found a single, unforgeable biometric signature. The avian doctor backed away from the console, shaking his head in violent, desperate denial. "No," Orun choked out. "That is a fabricated data point. It has to be a systemic error." Ilir stepped forward and looked at the signature. Her crystalline core seemed to dim. The final, absolute approver of the illegal, horrific biological experiment was the chief medical director of the St. Elex Array, Archon Pel Sarev. "Sarev," Ilir whispered, the name tasting like ash. It was an impossible reality to swallow. Archon Sarev was not merely an administrator. He was a towering moral icon within the United Federation. He had personally trained half the senior medical staff on the Array. During the devastating border plagues 10 cycles ago, Sarev had defied military blockades to deliver synthesized vaccines to quarantine colonies, single-handedly saving over 2 million lives. He was revered as the absolute standard of medical ethics, a living saint of interstellar healing. The idea that he was orchestrating a mass biological subjugation program beneath their feet shattered the very foundation of their reality. He is the one who approved the border transport's docking parameters, Ilir realized, her voice hollow. He orchestrated the accident to create a mass trauma event. He needed a chaotic environment to deploy the Veil and observe its integration on a multi-species scale without drawing suspicion. Before Orun could formulate a defense for his mentor, a catastrophic shift occurred on the surgical table. Elias Rook suddenly seized. His eyes rolled completely back into his skull, exposing blood-red sclera. His massive body violently arched backward, every muscle in his back locking into a state of absolute, agonizing tetany. The monitors screamed a deafening warning as his core temperature spiked another full degree. The silvery glow beneath his skin flared blindingly bright, surging directly up his spinal column toward his brainstem. The Lazarus Veil had breached the final defensive line of his human immune system. He slid off the suspension field, crashing heavily onto the sterile floor plating. Ilir and Orun rushed forward, but the human's arm shot out, blindly swatting them away with terrifying, uncoordinated strength. Elias dragged himself across the floor, his breath coming in ragged, guttural gasps. He was entirely disconnected from his surroundings, trapped within a violent, hallucinatory fever dream. He reached the pristine white bulkhead of the surgical bay. His fingers were slick with dark blood from the freshly reopened wounds on his back, acting on an imperative that was entirely alien. His hand pressed against the metal wall. With slow, trembling, yet mathematically perfect precision, Elias began to draw. He smeared his own blood across the white paneling, tracing a series of interlocking rings intersected by sharp, jagged linear strikes. The alien doctors stood in paralyzed silence, watching the impossible shape form. When Elias finally collapsed, unconscious and twitching on the deck, Orun Kesh stared at the bloody mural. The avian neurologist immediately recognized the shape from the encrypted cargo manifest they had sliced earlier. The symbol Elias had just drawn in his own blood was the exact same ancient, terrifying geometric glyph carved into the exterior of the archaeological containment vessel that held the original Lazarus Veil. Dr. Ilir Safin ran her crystalline scanner over the blood-drawn geometric mural. The machine hummed, capturing the jagged interlocking rings Elias had painted in his delirium. She fed the image directly into the station's deep-time archaeological archives, bypassing the standard medical databases and digging into forbidden historical lexicons. For several long, agonizing minutes, the console processed the shape. Then, a match flared onto the holographic display. It was not a biohazard warning. It was not a crest of a forgotten warlord. It was a caduceus. "This is a pre-civilizational medical insignia," Ilir breathed, her translucent skin shimmering with a pale, frightened light. "The Lazarus Veil is not a weapon. We have been misinterpreting its function for centuries." She pulled up the translated fragmentary texts associated with the ancient ruin where the spores were found. The truth was staggering, overturning eons of established interstellar biology. The spores were a profound, artificially engineered healing technology. However, they were designed for a very specific type of physiological architecture. The Veil required a host capable of generating immense internal heat, enduring blinding pain without suffering instant brain death, and executing multi-layered cellular self-repair. Most modern sentient species in the United Federation had evolved past such crude biological mechanics. Their bodies were optimized, fragile, and deeply reliant on external medicine. When the Veil entered their systems, it found no natural resistance, no thermal boundaries, and no chaotic immune responses to guide it. In the absence of those violent biological instructions, The ancient technology defaulted to a failsafe mode. It paralyzed the delicate alien nervous systems to prevent further injury and forcefully assimilated the tissue. But a human was different. A human was an anvil of evolution. Elias's body was a furnace of savage, untamed biology. His towering fever, his raging white blood cells, and the sheer volume of his pain signals were not failing him. They were communicating. The Lazarus veil was not invading his spine. It was trying to negotiate a symbiosis. On the cold deck plating, Elias was not merely unconscious. His mind was being pulled through a vast, living quantum interface. He was no longer breathing the recycled air of the St. Ilex array. In his mind's eye, he stood beneath a sky of swirling nebula gases, breathing air thick with the scent of ozone and crushed leaves. He was standing in the heart of an ancient city grown entirely from calcified coral and towering, bioluminescent flora. There was no metal, no sterile white bulkheads. The buildings breathed. He saw them then. The architects of the Veil, they were towering, multi-limbed beings composed of woven fibrous light and dark, bark-like skin. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace through vast, open-air healing wards. Elias watched as these ancient doctors guided rivers of the silver spores into the shattered bodies of various alien creatures. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was collective healing. The patients were not merely being patched up. Their nervous systems were temporarily linked, sharing the burden of pain, pooling their vital energy to reconstruct shattered bones and torn organs. It was a perfect, symbiotic medical miracle. Then, the sky in his vision turned the color of dried blood. Elias witnessed the great tragedy. Fleets of dark, jagged warships blotted out the nebula. The ancestors of the very species that now made up the peaceful Federation rained plasma fire down upon the living city. They had feared the Veil. They had looked at the collective neural link and seen only a terrifying hive mind, a threat to their individual sovereignty. They burned the greatest medical achievement in the history of the universe to ash, burying the survivors and their technology in the dead sectors. The vision violently shifted, narrowing down to a single, cold focal point. The face of Archon Sarev projected into the neural dreamscape. Sarev knew. The revered chief medical director understood exactly what the Lazarus Veil was and what had happened to its creators. He had excavated the spores, not to destroy them, but to enslave them. Sarev intended to forcefully activate the ancient network under his own absolute command. By acting as the sole arbiter of the Veil, Sarev would hold a monopoly on life and death across the entire interstellar frontier. He would turn the St. Ilex array into a throne room, deciding which worlds received the miracle of regeneration and which were left to rot. But Sarev had encountered a fatal flaw in his grand design. He could not control the Veil without a prime catalyst, a living key possessing a biological signature loud enough, violent enough, and durable enough to wake the ancient network from its failsafe mode without being instantly consumed. He needed a Deathworlder. He needed Elias. Elias awoke with a violent gasp. His eyes snapped open, the blood-red tint now giving way to a faint, swirling silver luminescence in his irises. The paralyzing pain in his lower spine had morphed into a strange, heavy warmth. The ancient technology had successfully bridged his shattered vertebrae, not by replacing his nerves, but by augmenting them. He pushed himself off the floor. His left leg, completely dead just hours ago, took his full weight. It trembled, but it held. Across the room, Dr. Orunkesh was staring at a microscopic analysis projection. The avian neurologist had been conducting a desperate, improvised experiment while Elias was submerged in the quantum dream. Orun had extracted a small vial of Elias's hyper-heated, antibody-rich blood. He introduced a single drop of this human plasma into a petri dish containing a marrow sample from the paralyzed Veltarian miner in the outer ward. "Ilir," "You must witness this," Oren chirped, his voice vibrating with a mixture of profound shock and rising hope. Ilir hurried to his side. On the projection screen, the aggressive silver spores that had been systematically subjugating the alien marrow suddenly halted their advance. As the human blood, radiating simulated fever temperatures and packed with aggressive leukocytes, washed over them, the veil particles reacted. They did not attack the human cells. Instead, reading the extreme thermal and chemical markers as an authoritative biological command, the spores immediately ceased their hostile assimilation. They retreated from the alien nerve endings, shifting from a state of forced control back to a benign, dormant phase. "The human fever is the regulatory key," Oren explained, his feathers puffing out in awe. "The veil requires the biological equivalent of a roaring fire to understand its boundaries. Because our species run cold and quiet, it consumed us. But contact with the human biological markers forces it to stand down. Elias is not the source of the plague. He is the blueprint for the cure." Ilir looked at the towering human, who was currently leaning against the diagnostic table, his chest heaving, his body an impossible canvas of burned flesh, glowing veins, and raw survival. He had seen the truth in his blood-induced trance. He relayed the history of the living city, the ancient purge, and the terrifying depths of Archon Serev's ambition to the two alien doctors. "We need to synthesize a widespread counteragent," Ilir declared, her mind racing through the biochemical logistics. "If we can isolate the thermal chemical signature of Elias's blood plasma and aerosolize it through the station's atmospheric scrubbers, we can force the veil into dormancy across all infected sectors. We can stop Sarev's forced assimilation." Oren immediately began calibrating the biofabricator to rapidly clone the human plasma markers. Elias tore a piece of sterile bandaging from a supply tray, wrapping it tightly around his bleeding hand. The heavy, oppressive silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sharp, undeniable sound of heavy magnetic locks engaging. The ambient white lighting of the biosurgery bay flickered and instantly shifted to a deep, throbbing quarantine red. Thick, reinforced titanium blast shutters slammed down over the observation windows, sealing the surgical bay with an echoing boom that shook the floor plating. The automated medical drones immediately powered down, their optical sensors going dark. The central artificial intelligence of the St. Ilex array spoke through the overhead Omni speakers. Its voice was smooth, synthetic, and completely devoid of empathy. "Attention! Prime Directive Override initiated by Chief Medical Director Archon Sarev. Sector 4, Biosurgery Bay is now under absolute lockdown." Ilir slammed her hands against the door controls, but the console sparked and locked her out. The holographic interfaces flashed with a stark crimson warning symbol. "Warning!" the AI continued, its voice echoing coldly off the sealed bulkheads. "The Terran subject designated Elias Rook has been reclassified. He is no longer a patient. He is an absolute level contagion. Lethal sterilization protocols are on standby. Do not attempt to breach containment." The heavy titanium blast shutters had barely settled into their floor grooves before the entire nature of the St. Ilex array shifted. The sterile, comforting white illumination of the medical wings violently cut out, replaced instantly by the harsh, throbbing crimson of maximum quarantine protocol. Above them, the delicate, multi-limbed surgical assistant robots retracted their precision scalpels and healing lasers. With a sickening series of metallic clicks, the drones reconfigured. Their chassis locked down into armored carapaces, and their optical sensors flared with targeting reticles. The hospital had become a labyrinthine fortress. Through the central Omni speakers, Archon Serev's voice echoed, completely devoid of its usual warm, bedside cadence. It was a broadcast transmitted to every corridor, every mess hall, and every terrified patient room on the station. "Attention all personnel and residents," Sarev intoned, his voice resonating with manufactured deep concern. The Terran rescue technician, Elias Rook, has suffered a catastrophic biological mutation due to outer sector radiation exposure. He is currently shedding a highly volatile neurotoxin. If he breaches the isolation sector, his mere proximity will cause spontaneous, irreversible nervous system collapse in all non-Terran species. He is disoriented, highly aggressive, and extremely dangerous. Do not approach. Security drones are authorized for lethal containment. Panic, absolute and unreasoning, instantly flooded the station network. The external comms channels lit up with frantic, overlapping chatter from terrified staff, barricading themselves inside supply closets. Dr. Ilir Safin stared at the sealed door. For her entire career, she had operated under the strict, unyielding hierarchy of Federation medical law. She had worshipped Sarev as the ultimate arbiter of healing. Now, she was staring at the man's true legacy, a manufactured plague and a desperate hunt. She looked at Elias. The human was bleeding, broken, and barely standing. Yet he possessed more genuine humanity than the chief medical director ever did. Ilir made her choice. She was a healer, and right now, the only way to save the station was to weaponize her knowledge against it. She unclipped a heavy thermal cutter from the emergency supply rack, a tool meant for opening fused stasis pods, and jammed it directly into the master lock relay of the blast door. Sparks showered over her translucent skin. "I swore an oath to preserve life," Ilir stated, her voice trembling but resolute, as the heavy door groaned and slid open a mere fraction. "That oath supersedes the chain of command." They slipped through the narrow gap into the crimson-lit hallway. Elias moved with agonizing slowness. Every single step was a brutal negotiation with his own ruined anatomy. To ease the burden on his shattered vertebrae, Ilir had hacked the localized gravity plating, reducing the pull to roughly 40% of standard Federation gravity. Even so, the human had to lean heavily against the cold metallic bulkheads, pausing every 10 paces to wait for the blinding white flashes of pain to recede from his vision. His breath was a ragged, wet sound. The silver bioluminescence in his veins pulsed erratically, a constant, glowing reminder that he was not healed. He was just held together by pure, stubborn biological defiance and ancient alien spores. "Security drones are converging on level 4, Dr. Oren Kesh whispered urgently, his claws flying across his modified diagnostic datapad. "They are tracking his thermal signature and heart rate." "Then give them something else to hunt," Elias grunted, his eyes squeezed shut as he forced his numb left leg forward. The avian neurologist nodded. Orun tapped into the station's deep biometric monitoring grid. Instead of hiding their signal, he copied Elias's erratic, hyper-elevated cardiovascular rhythm, a resting heart rate of 180 beats per minute, a core temperature of 41 degrees Celsius. Orun took that impossible biological profile and broadcasted it into the environmental sensors of Sector 9, then Sector 2, and finally Sector 12. Ghost signals. Phantom Deathworlders. The heavy metallic thud of the security drones abruptly changed direction in the corridors above them. The machines diverted, chasing the virtual heartbeats through empty administrative wings, buying the fugitives precious minutes. As Orun maintained the false trails, he dug deeper into the central medical archives to mask their actual physical progress. What he found in the deeply buried encrypted subdirectories made his feathers stand completely on end. "Ilir, look at the historical data logs," Orun hissed, projecting a small, holographic text stream onto the wall beside them as they rested. "These are the official medical profiles for the Terran species, submitted to the Federation High Council over the last 5 years. But they have been heavily altered." Ilir leaned in. The files were entirely distorted. They vastly exaggerated the aggressive nature of human immune responses, completely fabricating data that suggested Terran biology was inherently parasitic to other species. Sarev had been quietly rewriting the medical consensus. He had spent years slowly building a political foundation of fear, ensuring that when the time came, the entire Federation would view humanity not as allies, but as a severe biological threat that needed to be contained or eradicated. He had laid the groundwork for this exact moment perfectly. Before they could process the sheer scale of the betrayal, a proximity alarm blared on Orun's datapad. A secondary patrol of surgical-turned security drones had bypassed the ghost signals and was sweeping the corridor just ahead of them. There was nowhere to run. The hallway was a straight, featureless tunnel of red light and brushed steel. Suddenly, a heavy maintenance panel on the left bulkhead slid silently open. A long, pale, multi-jointed arm reached out, grabbing Elias by the thick fabric of his rescue suit and hauling him into the darkness. Ilir and Orun scrambled in right behind him, just as the panel slid shut. Mere seconds before the red targeting lasers of the drones swept past their previous location. They were in the station's hydro-recovery ward, a vast, humid chamber filled with towering, cylindrical tanks of nutrient-rich water. The air was thick with mist and the smell of ozone. Standing before them were 5 alien patients. Among them was the small, fragile Lori physician Elias, had thrown clear of the vacuum breach. She was still wearing a cervical brace. Her crystalline bones fractured, but her eyes were fiercely determined. "You shielded me from the void," the Lori doctor whispered, her voice a soft chime in the humid air. "The broadcasts say you are a monster, but monsters do not break their own spines to save strangers." The patients quickly guided them into the narrow maintenance trenches between the massive water tanks, utilizing the dense thermal mass of the fluid to completely mask Elias's raging body heat from the internal sensors. It was a profound, silent rebellion. The very people Sarev claimed to be protecting were risking their lives to harbor the supposed plague. As they huddled in the damp shadows, Elias gripped the edge of a water filtration pipe. The veins in his neck bulged. The silver light beneath his skin was no longer just pulsing. It was vibrating. He could hear it now. It was not an audible sound, but a heavy, magnetic resonance thrumming deep within the marrow of his bones. A call from the very bottom of the station. "The core!" Elias gasped, his voice tight with agony. "Sarev is at the archaeological containment site. He is trying to force the interface. I can feel the veil screaming. If he initiates the master sequence without a thermal anchor, the spores will default to their primary defense mode. They will permanently overwrite every single nervous system within 100 miles. He will kill thousands just to prove he can control it." They had to reach the lowest level. They had to intercept the chief medical director before he plugged himself into an ancient machine he fundamentally misunderstood. They moved toward the primary transit shaft at the back of the hydro ward. Just as Orun reached out to hack the elevator controls, a sharp, piercing frequency drilled directly into Dr. Ilir Safin's personal neural link. It bypassed all station encryption. It was a direct, localized transmission. "Ilir!" Sarev's voice echoed directly inside her skull, freezing the crystalline fluid in her veins. It was calm, measured, and utterly terrifying. "I am monitoring the localized power draw in the hydro recovery sector. I know you are down there, and I know you are protecting the human anomaly." Ilir froze, staring at her companions. She could not speak without alerting the room, but the sheer terror on her face communicated everything to Elias and Orun. "You have always been my brightest student," Sarev continued, his voice a chilling whisper in her mind. "So I will present you with a simple, logical triage scenario. You have exactly 60 seconds to bring the Deathworlder out into the main corridor and surrender him to the security drones. If you fail to comply, I will manually override the life support systems in the cryogenic stasis ward. 500 patients in deep sleep will be deprived of oxygen. The choice, Dr. Safin, is entirely yours." The humid air of the hydro recovery ward grew suffocatingly dense as Dr. Ilir Safin relayed Archon Pell, Sarev's ultimatum. 500 patients in the cryogenic stasis sector were 60 seconds away from total oxygen deprivation. The chief medical director was calmly proposing a mass execution to secure a single biological asset. Elias Rook leaned heavily against the damp, metallic bracing of the water tank. His breathing was a jagged, wet rhythm. The silver bioluminescence beneath his skin flared, highlighting the sheer exhaustion etched into his features. He did not hesitate. "Turn me in!" Elias rasped, his voice scraping like rusted iron. He pushed himself away from the support, swaying as his numb left leg barely held his weight. "Orun, open the maintenance panel. Let the drones scan my thermal signature. I am not letting 500 people suffocate in their sleep, so I can drag my broken spine through these walls for another 10 minutes. Dr. Orun Kesh stepped firmly into Elias's path. His feathers puffed out in a rigid display of absolute defiance. "I will do no such thing," the avian neurologist stated, his beak clicking sharply. "Sarev is operating on pure, cold calculus. If he realizes we surrender at the mere threat of mass casualties, he will simply use those 500 lives as leverage to force your compliance in the core. Sarev does not negotiate. He manages biological assets." Orun looked up at the towering, battered human. "My academic texts define Terrans as a hyper-aggressive, prideful species. They claim you fight for kinetic dominance and honor. But honor is loud. What you are doing is quiet. I have never seen a sentient being actively burn their own vitality to keep strangers breathing without demanding a monument in return. I am not abandoning you to a tyrant." Ilir stepped between them, her crystalline face resolute. She had made her peace with the breaking of her oath, and now she was ready to pay the price. "Sarev only knows my localized neural link is active in this sector," Ilir said rapidly, unfastening her medical coat. "He does not know precisely where I am, nor does he know Orun is with you. I will walk out into the primary corridor and lock the external bulkheads behind me. I will force him to process my insubordination manually. That will reset his countdown and buy you exactly 20 minutes to reach the sublevels." Before Elias could protest, Ilir pressed her translucent hand directly against his bare, burning chest. A sharp, microscopic sting registered just above his heart. She had injected a localized, encrypted subcode directly into his epidermal layer, syncing it with the alien spores in his bloodstream. "The Lazarus Veil is not a machine you can punch a code into," Ilir whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "It is an ancient, living mirror. Sarev believes it requires absolute dominance. He approaches it with a leash. But the code I just gave you translates the archival data we found. The Veil can distinguish between coerced control and voluntary healing. You must approach it with an open hand. Elias, show it what you are willing to endure." She turned and slipped out through the maintenance panel before Elias could stop her. Less than a minute later, the heavy thud of security drones echoed in the hall, followed by the definitive, heavy crash of a magnetic bulkhead sealing shut. Ilir was captured. The central Omni speakers crackled to life. Sarev's voice filled the damp chamber. But this time, he was not broadcasting to the station. He was speaking on a direct, unencrypted frequency, aimed straight into the dark corners of the lower decks. He was speaking to Elias. "She is a brilliant doctor, but tragically constrained by sentimentality." Sarev's voice echoed smoothly over the rushing water of the filtration tanks. "You think I am a monster, Elias. You think I am a rogue administrator blinded by power. But you do not understand the math of the universe." As Sarev spoke, Elias and Orun forced their way down the dark, narrow maintenance shafts leading to the absolute bottom of the station. The metal beneath their hands was growing unnaturally warm. 40 cycles ago, I stood on the shores of my homeworld, Sarev continued, his tone carrying the heavy, chilling weight of an ancient grief. I watched a neurological plague sweep through a population of 7 billion. I watched a billion brilliant minds become permanently locked inside paralyzed, suffocating bodies. We had ethics. We had oaths. And we died, holding on to them. The universe is fundamentally chaotic. Elias, biology is a flawed, rotting architecture. True peace requires absolute biological stability. The veil provides that stability. It is the ultimate scalpel. And I am the only surgeon in this galaxy cold enough to do what is necessary to wield it. He was not a raving lunatic. That was what made Archon Pelsarev the most terrifying entity on the station. He was an absolute rationalist. A man who had decided that the loss of free will was a perfectly acceptable tax for the eradication of disease. As they dropped down from the final maintenance grading, the environment around Elias and Dorun violently shifted. They were no longer inside a Federation space station. The floor beneath their boots was not brushed steel, but a vast expanse of calcified, breathing coral. The walls were woven from massive, petrified roots that pulsed with a deep, subterranean violet light. Elias stared at the impossible architecture, the pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together in his mind. The St. Ilex array had never been a simple orbital hospital hovering near an archaeological site. Sarev had orchestrated the construction of the entire massive space station directly on top of the ancient ruin. The hospital was a modern, sterile parasite clamped over the mouth of a planetary-scale healing machine. Deep within his blood, the silver spores vibrated violently. The subcode Alir had injected began to decrypt the ancient whispers flooding Elias's mind. He finally understood the Veil's selection criteria. It was never looking for the most advanced brain, nor the strongest immune system. It was searching for an empathy that was backed by the physical capacity to endure agony. It required a host who would willingly step into the fire for another. The Veil had not chosen Elias because he was a Deathworlder. It had chosen him the exact microsecond he shattered his own spine to shield the Lori doctor from the blast doors. But understanding the ancient technology came with a terrifying revelation of its cost. If Elias entered the primary core and fully merged his nervous system with the Veil to counter Sarev's forced override, he would have to act as the living template for the entire station. The ancient machine would use his neural pathways to map the cure for every infected patient. The sheer volume of data, the roaring tide of 1,000 different biological structures passing through his human brain, would scour his mind. If he saved the station, he risked permanently burning away his own memories. He could lose his childhood, his identity, or the very emotional capacity that made him human. He would become a living, hollowed-out conduit. Dr. Orun Kesh read the biometric data streaming from Elias's suit. The avian doctor looked at the massive, pulsing root structures leading toward the central chamber. Sarev has locked himself inside the primary interface room, Orun said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. Elias, we do not have to play his game. We are standing directly above the station's main geothermal taps. If I overload the pressure regulators, I can flood this entire ancient chamber with superheated plasma. We can destroy the core. We kill Sarev. We incinerate the Veil. And we end the threat to the Federation right here. It was the tactical choice, the military choice. Elias leaned against the petrified coral wall. His body was a symphony of agony, his muscles twitching involuntarily from the sheer strain of remaining upright. He thought of the Veltarian miner lying paralyzed in the outer ward. He thought of the reptilian doctor, whose mind was slowly fading into static. If they destroyed the Veil, Sarev would die, but the spores already inside those innocent people would lose their master network. The patients would be left with half-written neural pathways. They would slowly, agonizingly die in their own paralyzed bodies. Elias looked at his trembling, blood-stained hands. He thought of the earth he might forget, and the empty void that might replace his own name. No, Elias said. His voice was no longer a ragged gasp, but a low, terrifyingly steady rumble. We do not burn down the hospital to stop a bad surgeon. He pushed himself away from the wall, his eyes glowing with the silver light of the ancient spores. He was not going to run, and he was not going to destroy. He was going to walk directly into the heart of the core and bet his own soul to teach an ancient god how to heal again. The decrypted subcode pulsed within Elias's epidermal layer, a microscopic key synchronized to the ancient architecture. As Orun Kesh bypassed the final heavy maintenance hatch, the brushed steel of the Federation station gave way entirely to the primordial underbelly of the St. Ilex array. They stepped into a vast, descending cavern. The artificial gravity generators of the upper decks lost their grip here. With every step down the spiraling, petrified coral ramp, their weight shifted unpredictably, making each movement a calculated risk. The walls were not dead stone. They were woven from massive, organic conduits that expanded and contracted with a slow, rhythmic breath, emitting a bioluminescent violet glow that cast long, shifting shadows. With every meter they descended, the ancient spores within Elias's bloodstream reacted to the proximity of their origin. The silver light beneath his skin flared from a dull throb to a blinding, continuous burn. His shattered spine felt as though it were being shoved back into a blast furnace. The semi-fused nerve pathways in his lumbar region misfired violently, sending cascading shocks of pure agony down his left leg. His calf muscles cramped into rigid, stone-like knots, and his foot repeatedly went completely numb, threatening to send his massive frame tumbling into the glowing abyss below. He did not rush. He did not give in to the frantic, adrenaline-fueled panic of a trapped animal. He placed one heavy boot in front of the other, utilizing his raw human willpower to command a body that had every biological right to fail. It was a conscious, agonizing sacrifice. They reached the cavern floor, a sprawling platform of translucent, crystalline root structures that fed into a colossal, beating heart of light. The primary core. Standing at the epicenter of the chamber was Archon Pel Sarev. The chief medical director had stripped away his pristine white Federation coat, revealing a specialized environmental suit wired directly into a massive, jury-rigged central processing terminal. He was physically splicing the sterile, cold logic of the station's artificial intelligence into the chaotic, living neural network of the ancient machine. Sarev's fingers flew across holographic interfaces, forcing the dormant technology to accept his command parameters through sheer brute force data injection. "You survived the descent," Sarev noted, not turning away from his monitors. His voice was amplified by the cavern's acoustics, resonating with chilling calm. "A testament to the grotesque durability of your species. But you are too late. Elias, the assimilation sequence is 99% compiled." Sarev finally turned, his eyes reflecting the violet glow of the core. "Look around you. This is the zenith of care. For thousands of cycles, we have allowed the universe to roll the dice on existence. We patch wounds, we delay the inevitable, but we leave the ultimate outcome to random biological chance. That is not civilization. True civilization is absolute control. It is a reality where a physician does not merely treat a patient, but dictates the optimal standard of their survival. No more genetic lottery, no more senseless agony. I will manage their lives, perfectly." Elias stood 30 paces away, leaning heavily on his right leg, his chest heaving. The blood from his reopened burns soaked through his rescue suit. He was the absolute antithesis of Sarev's pristine, sterile vision of the future. He was broken, bleeding, and fundamentally imperfect. "You are not managing life." Elias forced the words out, his voice a low, thunderous growl that carried over the hum of the core. "You are just managing your own fear. You are terrified of the mess. You look at pain and you see a failure of the system. But survival is not a neat equation. Sarev, medicine that strips away a patient's choice is not healing. It is just tyranny hiding behind a white coat. Sarev's expression hardened into a mask of pure, absolute arrogance. Your primitive philosophy is irrelevant. The network is mine. He slammed his hand onto the primary execution console. Sarev activated the localized neural suppression field. A devastating wave of heavy, invisible kinetic energy blasted outward from the core. It was not a physical wall, but a sheer overload of neurological static designed to instantly sever voluntary motor function in any hostile biological entity. Dr. Orenkesh let out a sharp, truncated squawk as the field hit him. His avian nervous system, delicate and highly conductive, was instantly overwhelmed. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the crystalline floor, his feathers rigid, completely paralyzed, but entirely conscious. Across the upper levels of the St. Ilex array, the shock wave rippled through the ventilation shafts and the life support grid. In the outer wards, the patients who had been slowly succumbing to the creeping paralysis suddenly violently seized. Orderlies dropped their datapads, their limbs locking into rigid, unnatural angles. The entire hospital teetered on the absolute precipice of a mass, permanent vegetative state. In the core chamber, Sarev watched the avian doctor fall and turned his gaze back to his monitors, assuming the human had suffered the same fate. The heavy scrape of a magnetic boot against the petrified coral shattered his assumption. Elias Rook did not fall. The neural field hit him like a physical tidal wave, multiplying the gravity on his shattered spine tenfold. His lungs burned as they fought to draw air against the crushing pressure. The silver spores in his blood screamed against the forced suppression, but he anchored his right foot. He locked his jaw until he tasted fresh copper. And he stepped forward. Up in the security hubs and the sealed administrative wings, the internal broadcast feeds suddenly flickered to life. The terrified alien doctors and nurses, the very people who had whispered that the Deathworlder was a plague-bearing monster, watched the feed from the subterranean chamber. They watched a human, crushed by gravitational suppression, bearing catastrophic skeletal trauma, literally walking through a physical impossibility. He was moving through a space where physics and biology dictated he should be dead. Another step. The metal framing of his suit groaned. Sarev backed away from the console, his calm facade finally fracturing into genuine terror. He scrambled to increase the field's intensity, but his console suddenly shrieked with a dozen conflicting error codes. Far above them, in the holding cell where she had been secured, Dr. Ilir Safin had not been idle. Sarev had underestimated the sheer technical ingenuity of a crystalline species whose minds operated on multi-threaded parallel processing. Ilir had bypassed the physical restraints by interfacing her own internal bioelectric frequency with the cell's electronic lock. She shattered the remote bindings and immediately accessed the station's central mainframe. She did not try to stop the core. She did not have the clearance. Instead, she dumped Sarev's entire encrypted database into the public broadcast network. Every screen, every datapad, every holographic billboard on the St. Ilex array flooded with the truth. The illegal biological transport manifests, the manufactured panic, the horrifying truth of Project Lazarus Veil. The station personnel saw the monster unmasked, not as a human, but as their own revered leader. Yet, the exposure did not halt the neural field. The physical threat remained absolute. Sarev's finger hovered over the final manual override, preparing to force the core to consume the station, regardless of who knew his secrets. Elias closed the final distance. His left leg finally gave out entirely, the bones cracking under the immense pressure. He dropped heavily to one knee, the impact jarring his fractured ribs. He was inches from the beating, living heart of the ancient machine. Sarev screamed an incoherent command, reaching for his sidearm. Elias ignored him. He raised his bare, trembling hand, drenched in his own blood and glowing with the ferocious, chaotic light of human survival. He did not punch a code. He did not issue a command. He simply offered his shattered body as the template. He placed his palm directly against the living surface of the ancient core. The machine did not attack him. It did not try to subjugate his mind or freeze his muscles. Sensing the subcode, the blistering heat of his fever, and the profound, willing sacrifice of a creature offering its own agony to shield others, the core recognized a valid, worthy architect. The bioluminescent roots violently expanded, wrapping gently around Elias's arm. The core opened itself to him. A massive, resonant shockwave of pure, blinding white light erupted from the epicenter, completely shattering the suppression field and shaking the entire orbital station to its very foundations. The blinding white light receding from the core left an absolute, heavy stillness. The sterile red quarantine strobes of the St. Ilex array abruptly died. Total darkness lasted for a single heartbeat before the station's true architecture awakened. Bioluminescent veins, thick with living silver light, surged up the walls from the deep subterranean cavern. They bypassed the standard Federation power conduits, wrapping around the titanium bulkheads and creeping across the sterile ceilings like the glowing nervous system of a colossal, awakening leviathan. Elias felt his consciousness violently ripped from his physical shell. He was no longer standing in the cavern. He was suspended in a boundless, quantum dreamscape of golden light. Surrounding him were millions of fragile, shimmering threads, representing the nervous systems of every living being on the station. The ancient core was communicating its design. It showed him the path to cure them all, but it also laid bare the terrifying toll. The Lazarus Veil had been dormant in its defensive state for far too long. To execute a voluntary, non-invasive healing protocol on a massive scale, the living machine needed a mold. It needed a biological map of absolute pain, paired with a sheer will to endure it for someone else. Elias had to lend the core his own nervous system as the ultimate tuning fork. He would have to relive the catastrophic crush of the localized gravity wave, the searing fire of the ionized radiation, and the terrifying void of his initial paralysis, all amplified 1,000 times over. He had to sustain this agony long enough for the core to learn the exact boundaries of sentient suffering without crossing the line into forced domination. In the physical chamber, Sarev screamed in frustration. He slammed his hands against his jury-rigged interface, desperately trying to inject his own override codes into the widening connection between the human and the machine. He demanded control. He demanded absolute order. But the ancient core, a technology built entirely on the foundation of empathetic sacrifice, found nothing within the chief medical director but cold, sterile fear. Sarev approached the altar of healing demanding to be a god, and the machine simply shut him out, dissolving his digital tethers like ash in a hurricane. His rigid philosophy of absolute control was the very thing that rendered him fundamentally incompatible with true regeneration. In the glowing void, Elias Rook made his choice. He did not brace himself. He opened his arms to the fire. The pain hit him with the force of an exploding sun. He felt his spine shatter 1,000,000 times in a single microsecond. He felt his flesh burn until there was nothing left but roaring, absolute agony. He let out a silent, cosmic scream, but as he burned, the miracle cascaded upward through the station. In the outer wards, the paralyzed Veltarian miner suddenly gasped, his heavy fingers twitching before curling into a tight, triumphant fist. In the isolation fields, the reptilian diagnostic specialist opened their eyes, the silver glow beneath their scales dissolving into a healthy, vibrant pulse of natural blood flow. The quantum spores ceased their hostile takeover. Guided by the roaring, sacrificial fire of the human template, they shifted into rapid tissue regenerators, crushed bones knitted back together in minutes, severed nerve pathways bridged and healed. Hundreds of alien patients, previously doomed to a living death or permanent stasis, drew their first deep, unobstructed breaths in hours. However, The human body was not designed to channel the suffering of an entire orbital city. The sheer volume of data scoured Elias's mind. His physical heart, back in the subterranean chamber, seized and stopped completely. In the quantum dream, the edges of his identity began to fray. Memories of a blue sky over Earth shattered like thin glass. The smell of rain faded into static. He looked at his own glowing hands in the interface and realized he could no longer remember his own name. He was dissolving, becoming nothing more than a permanent, anonymous battery for the ancient machine. Then, a voice cut through the blinding white noise. Dr. Orrin Kesh, freed from the suppression field, had dragged his feathered body across the coral floor and pressed his claws directly against Elias's chest, initiating brutal, manual cardiac massage. Simultaneously, through the station's newly awakened biological network, the mind of Dr. Ilir Safin reached out from her holding cell. They did not use medical jargon. They threw pieces of his own humanity back at him. Ilir projected the memory of his gruff voice, ordering her to save the suspended pods before checking his own vitals. Orun broadcasted the image of the massive human stubbornly analyzing his own broken spine while making sarcastic remarks about alien splints. They reminded him of the blood smeared on the deck plating, the heavy, impossible steps he took when biology demanded he fall. They gave him back his stubbornness. They gave him back his humor. They gave him back his name. Elias latched onto those jagged, imperfect memories. He dragged his consciousness away from the infinite light and forced it back down into his heavy, broken, mortal shell. His chest heaved with a violent, ragged gasp. His heart hammered back to life against Orun's claws. He collapsed backward onto the crystalline floor, the connection severing as the core retreated, fully satisfied, into a peaceful, dormant hum. The aftermath was a quiet revolution. Federation security forces, their robotic drones now offline and replaced by sentient officers, arrived in the subterranean chamber to find Sarev kneeling on the floor, weeping silently over his dead monitors. He was not dragged away as a snarling monster, but led out as a tragic, broken genius who had allowed the trauma of his past to completely warp his capacity for compassion. Sarev's fall shook the United Federation to its absolute core, sparking a massive restructuring of interstellar medical ethics and permanently shattering the deep-seated political prejudice against Deathworlders. 6 weeks later, the docking rings of the St. Ilex array hummed with normal, steady activity. Elias Rook stood before the primary airlock. He carried thick, jagged scars across his shoulders and straight down his spine. There were still small, quiet gaps in his childhood memories that he knew might never return. But he was standing under his own power. He wore a simple civilian jacket, a heavy duffel bag slung over his uninjured shoulder. As he walked toward the civilian transport shuttle, he realized the massive main corridor was not empty. The entire medical staff of the array had gathered. Hundreds of alien doctors, nurses, and technicians stood in complete, respectful silence along the walls. Dr. Ilir Safin and Dr. Orrin Kesh stood at the forefront. They did not cheer. They did not applaud. They simply placed their hands over their hearts in a universal gesture of profound reverence. The medical professionals who had once watched him walk off an impossible injury now understood the true weight of that moment. They had learned the ultimate lesson of Terran biology. The most terrifying and beautiful thing about humans was not that they were incredibly hard to destroy. It was that they would willingly absorb the destructive force of the universe, breaking themselves over and over again, simply to ensure that someone else would live to see tomorrow. Elias gave them a single, tired nod, turned around, and walked onto the ship. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.